Hello, visibility enthusiasts. Welcome to the Beyond Visibility Lounge, the podcast that explores the seen and unseen world of the supply chain, logistics, transportation, and traceability. I'm your host, Iliriana Kachaniku.
And I'm your co-host, Ron Volpe.
And together, we are on a mission to inspire collaborative visibility innovations in the future. In today's episode, we're exploring a very interesting aspect of supply chain visibility. It is a topic that affects each one of us every single day. In fact, multiple times a day. It's food. And this is not necessarily about how the food arrives to our tables only. Rather, it is how safely and uncontaminated it arrives to our tables. While we may think about this topic when news of salmonella-contaminated iceberg salad has been recalled from the shelves of our favorite supermarket, the regulators, manufacturers, food producers, and logistics providers need to think of food safety every single day. To be able to capture unsafe events timely and early, visibility of food supply chains is needed. And because of interconnected supply chains, the ability to investigate backwards and trace the outbreak of an epidemic or public health threat is paramount. Ron, other than advanced technologies, has there been any particular driver to the necessity to maintain visibility in the food supply chains?
In fact, yes. On January 4th, 2011, President Obama signed into law the Food Safety Modernization Act, known as FSMA. It was the first major overhaul of food laws in the United States since 1938, and it was necessitated by the high number of evidenced foodborne illnesses in the preceding years. In 2011, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention estimated that because of foodborne diseases, roughly 1 in 6 Americans, or 48 million people, get sick, 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die each year. Passing of FSMA equipped the Food and Drug Administration with a legislative mandate to regulate how foods are grown, harvested, and processed. This legislative shift emphasized a proactive approach to prevent food safety issues, moving away from the previous focus on reacting to problems after they had already occurred. As one of its key provisions, FSMA addressed the need for rapid and effective tracking and tracing of food. As the FDA explained, and I quote, "In the case of a foodborne illness outbreak or contamination event, efficient product tracing helps government agencies and those who produce and sell food to rapidly find the source of the product and where contamination may have occurred. This enables faster removal of the affected product from the marketplace, reducing instances of foodborne illnesses." So that's why visibility in the food supply chain becomes imperative for our overall safety and health.
That is so enlightening and important, Ron. And now I am even more excited that we are talking to Thomas Burke, our next guest. Thomas is genuinely a rare find. He is an epidemiologist with expertise in food safety, sustainability, IT architectures, data carriers, visibility standards, and interoperability. Each one of these is a critical ingredient needed for development of digital traceability solutions. His journey from epidemiology led him to state institutions, federal agencies, for-profit food seller, and a non-profit standardization organization. We really could not wish for a better guest today to unpack for our audience the importance and complexity of food traceability. So let's dive into the conversation and listen to what he had to share about visibility and supply chains of the food.
Welcome to another edition of the Beyond Visibility Lounge with Iliriana and I, and we're thrilled to have with us today Thomas Burke. Thomas has an amazing background in food traceability. He was with the IFT, he was with Chipotle, and he consulted for the FDA, and he's currently pursuing his doctorate in agricultural economics. I'm reading off at University of Göttingen. I'm not pronouncing that at all, Thomas. I'll let you correct me.
Yeah, I'm at the University of Göttingen at the moment.
So thank you so much. I will say before you start talking, Thomas is one of the smartest guys in the food traceability space that I know. And he also has a really unique knack for making the complex seem simple, which is great for people to understand things about food traceability. So I'm going to hand it over and let Thomas introduce himself and talk a bit about his background. Thank you for joining, Thomas.
Thanks so much, Ron, and thanks, Iliriana, for having me on the show and allowing me to talk about myself and my passions. I would say that food traceability is a particular passion of mine. So yeah, to give a bit of background on myself, I started my career being mainly interested in infectious disease epidemiology and public health systems. And really based on what I was looking at in the public health landscape, I was kind of making some fundamental decisions. You kind of start when you work as an epidemiologist, you start thinking about specific exposures of interest that you're going to cultivate your research pathway on as you grow in your career. And early on in mine, I was thinking about these exposures and what we as humans are encountering and are determinants in our health outcomes. And one thing that I kind of felt like was underutilized and actually was more relevant to the way, where I came from and what I had been interested in was on food systems. And I also felt like at the time I was finishing my master's studies around 2016 that I wanted to be able to pivot between, maybe working in a public health agency or also working in industry. And food safety was this area where I could look at infectious diseases. I could work towards the improvement of like global health as a whole, but I also could work in a variety of realms. And I think that's always something that I have found a lot of passion for, is figuring out ways for multiple types of organizations to come together and resolve challenges. And so my practicum, which is like this practical experience that you have when you're doing your master's in public health, got me into this world, working at the Georgia Department of Agriculture in their food safety division. And actually what struck me most strongly, I worked on a variety of different public health challenges while I was there, but the thing that stuck out to me that I got very, very interested in was working up traceback investigations. So for, when a epidemiologic relevant foodborne illness has occurred and we have determined what that food vehicle is, you have to systematically find out where it is in the supply chain and where there might be exposures of interest or where maybe exposures to the public, and how can you mobilize public health workers in order to take products off shelves, and also to do remediation activities, or to figure out what the root cause was of this. Where was the breakdown in public health systems? And so I found this information to be highly, highly valuable. But back when I was working at the Georgia Department of Agriculture, a lot of our information that we obtained was very analog. It was pieces of paper, literal pieces of paper that were in filing cabinets. And so not only was it that availability, it was that you had to actually have somebody there, or somebody that knew where it was in order for you to be able to take these really critical public health actions. So I really started getting very interested in the related skills that it would take in order to improve these systems as a whole, and to be able to take this, increasingly digitized infectious disease information that was coming from whole genome sequencing and culture-independent diagnostic testing, as well as the increasingly sophisticated epidemiology that we were obtaining, and also having some sort of corroborative or corresponding digitization of supply chain data in order to really complete the picture. So this grew really as a area of interest for me, and I continued to hone skills in information technology, as well as actually the business components of these systems, because these systems are principally business systems. And their cultivation are based on, business use cases, on the economy of scales, and also on cooperative processes. And so I found a really great opportunity at the Institute of Food Technologists to work as a researcher on this. And this is really where I cut my teeth in traceability, and where I worked on some of the most critical projects that I think that have defined the way that I approach traceability, as well as what I want to project into the future with my research interests. At the Institute of Food Technologists and the Global Food Traceability Center, I worked on an initiative called the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, where I eventually became the technical lead, actually. This was a cooperative effort, funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to have an interoperable end-to-end digital traceability standard. And this is a very wonky way of trying to ameliorate externalities associated with a specific commodity. But because there was this need across the supply chain to have a means to port this information to various and disparate information systems, it really paved the way for a lot of future food traceability initiatives, especially ones that have interoperability as a core to their mission. I also worked at Chipotle Mexican Grill. I really wanted to actually work on real supply chains. I was working as a researcher at a nonprofit, and it was a great experience, but you never really see where the true breakdowns occur, because you are, when you're working with willing participants in a standardization initiative, they're not necessarily going to show you the where things may break down. And I wanted to really see that. I wanted to see how I could take a food traceability program and work on maybe new analytical techniques, introducing new programs, but also just really getting fundamentally knowledgeable about all of the supply chain processes. And Chipotle gave me a great platform for this, because it's they have this extensive food traceability system, and that they have a variety of different products in each of their meals that they provide to their customers. So I got to really get deep insights into fresh produce, and a lot of different types of fresh produce, meat and poultry products, as well as dairy. So I really have very fond memories of there, and I worked on some very interesting projects, like introducing RFID as a data carrier in food service settings. But then I got also a incredible opportunity to work at the Food and Drug Administration in the Office of Food Policy and Response, and really the chance to work with some of my idols, such as those in the in an FDA core, as well as figures like Frankie Yanis. I really couldn't turn down an opportunity like that. And also, me as a public health professional always was excited about the possibility of working for the U.S. federal government. So during my tenure there, I was able to get to use my expertise in digital systems and food traceability towards the rollouts of the food traceability rule, and also some of the supporting data systems. And then I also got to work on infant formula, which was very interesting as well. But I think we won't necessarily go there in the conversation today. But seeing the role that government has in an increasingly complex world, and what they're being confronted with in somewhat unconventional ways, and what food agencies or agencies that deal with the regulation of food, what they have to balance, is really exciting to see up close. And lastly, now I'm at the University of Göttingen. I really have wanted to work on a long-term food traceability and food systems research project, but it's difficult to do that in working in the government, or working in industry, or even at a nonprofit, because you don't really get to dictate the terms of your research in the same way that you can as a dedicated researcher. So that's a brief, actually a little bit of a long history of myself, but I hope that it kind of gives some of the listeners some ideas on like where I've been and where I'm in the paradigm that I'm coming from when I'm talking about food traceability.
Thomas, this is beyond impressive. And what I'm really struck by is your intrinsic curiosity to understand the issues that come and the importance of the food tracing, but then also your exposure to look into it from all three sectors: for-profit, non-profit, and regulatory, like governmental. So in our podcast, and the purpose of this podcast that drove Rod and I to launch it, was really the need to identify different challenges, opportunities, and trends within the supply chain visibility. It is a growing phenomenon, or a value creation, especially with proliferation of different digital technologies. And when it comes to the traceability and the importance of the visibility, I would love to learn from you. Why do you feel traceability specifically is so important in the food space, and how does enhanced visibility contribute to improving the food safety and traceability in general?
Yeah, I definitely can speak to that. I mean, yeah, as I speak, I am incredibly passionate about this area, and maybe it's just because it combines a bunch of different interests of mine into one thing. It's kind of funny when you think about specific experiences in your past that were like kind of aha moments or just idle curiosities that feed into into a field such as this. And one of the things that I kind of described when I was first getting started at IFT and we were thinking about working on the global dialogue on seafood traceability was I was like, as I was thinking through the problems, I'm like, in some ways, I'm trying to think about how does the world work? Like how does, what are our motivations as, societies, and how do we keep ourselves running, right? And that's where a lot of the challenges in traceability and supply chain visibility occur for the food industry, but also probably more broadly for other commodities. But I think that's where a lot of my interest ends up becoming, peaked, is that you have to understand all of these dimensions about like the role of the state in regulating product. And you have to understand also like the ever-changing technological landscape and what that can possibly do. And as well as like, how do we continue to think about food as a product, both as a economic driver, but also as a intrinsic component of the public's health. And so when we're thinking about like the challenges to the food system and where traceability can play a role, this is, traceability isn't unique, right, to food. Like there is traceability necessary in pharmaceuticals. There's increasingly interest in traceability of, airline parts, even of like tires, like things that where you need to understand what that life cycle of the product is, and where breakdowns in a complex value chain may compromise either the integrity of the product, the integrity of like public goods, or the individual health outcomes of someone. So things that are very important, though, that make food traceability unique is that one, it often is a perishable product. I mean, it almost always is. I mean, there are products that are highly shelf stable, so they kind of have characteristics of something that's not perishable. But at its core, it is something that has a high degree of throughput, that has has many different things that are can contribute to its safety profile, where there can be many actors that play a role in the production of the product, and where there is a lot of incremental decision making that occurs along this chain that can make a big difference in the end product for the consumer, not just from a safety perspective, but from a quality one as well. And as we work in a very constrained environment, thinking about what capital investments we can have, how do we future proof against potentially disruptive events. How do we deal with, a safety profile that isn't always completely known? I mean, like one of the things that is really difficult about working with food as a food safety scientist is that we always find a new way that microorganisms can contaminate products that we didn't know before, because either we didn't have the tools or we actually introduce new risks just based on the way that the world changes. So all of these things make the interest in visibility at each production step really paramount, and really wanting to foster systems in which you can communicate that visibility so that you can have better cooperative auxiliary processes. If you do combine a lot of that, then you can end up having better overall outcomes, but also retaining the systems that work, right? Because we have built these systems over time for good reason. A lot of food industry people have decades of experience, and they've seen many different things. And the reasons why that they have the habits and the tendencies that they do is based on this life experience. So we want to be able to improve these systems for sure, because we do know that there's blind spots. We do know that there are potentially safety risks. We do know that there's other externalities such as ecosystem destruction or contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. But we need to be able to empower ourselves with data to make smart decisions and to make investments in predictive predictable changes. We don't want to have a truly disruptive change to supply chain systems. We've seen what that looks like, and it's very difficult to deal with, and there can be grave consequences to that. So those are some of the factors that feed into the value of visibility in food supply chain systems, and it also explains a little bit of my passion for the area.
Thanks so much, Thomas. One of the questions I have, and it's kind of a little bit of the elephant in the room, is that FSMA 204 and the changes around that the FDA has made to the traceability rules is obviously looming in terms of the go live date coming up in a couple of years. How do you have a perspective on how the industry is moving toward compliance with the new rules, whether that's going well, not well? Just interested in your perspective.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would, it's one of these things where there are constraints to what the way that the compliance date has been put forward. So, as you are definitely aware, Ron, but maybe the audience may not be as familiar with, is that this is a regulation that is a component of the Food Safety Modernization Act, something that was passed in 2011. It is 2023 now. Time flies quite fast, I guess. But this is actually something that the FDA had to act on based on a lawsuit. So there's actually they needed to they had a specific window that they needed to meet in order to get the rule out the door, as well as this is factored into some of the compliance dates as well. So what this has resulted in is something that is not necessarily ideal from a industry implementation point of view. I mean, I think industry always wants to have more time, especially when you're dealing with large scale changes and things that may require information technology investments. So it's a very aggressive window. I mean, having said that, though, there also needs to be movement on this as well. We have seen challenges in being able to respond to foodborne illness emergencies and in having effective recalls. And, the technology does exist to help mobilize folks towards meeting the expectations of the rule. The rule is designed in such a way, in my opinion, as a way to enable innovation without prescribing what this technology should necessarily be. I mean, when you think about it, you don't want the government to dictate necessarily specific file formats or approaches, because they're going to base it based on government systems, which are not going to be optimized around the way that industry has. So I think there can be a means towards, utilizing existing and new standardization techniques and available technologies. But I think it will be a challenge for many industry participants to meet their own satisfaction in the time frame that occurs. I'm not necessarily advocating for one way or the other, but what I will say, I do think it's absolutely possible to meet the implementation window, but it will require a all hands on deck approach, as well as a engagement across stakeholders within each individual organization and with their supply chain partners. This is a way that industry needs to move, and they will see the benefits very immediately. But they have to be wholeheartedly committed to this. They can't just see this as merely like an accounting procedure. They need to see this as central to their responsibility of both safety as well as a way to improve their overall supply chain visibility tactics and strategy. So those are some of my thoughts. Although I think I could go for a very long time about this.
Thomas, you're also touching something that is important on global level. While we see the FSMA regulating the operations predominantly in the US, the global trade is increasingly global, and that includes food. But the regulations sometimes will require some alignment with other regulations. And you being a European with hands-on experience in US, do you see that there are alignments in the way that different systems, global systems, are addressing the traceability through the regulations? Or are we seeing overlaps that may challenge rather than support traceability on global level?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ileana. And it's actually something that I've thought about to an extent, outside of, just as like a idle curiosity as I've been working through traceability initiatives. Is this something that could eventually be a, non-tariff trade barrier of sorts, right? Where you may have non-interoperable approaches to traceability on a regulatory basis that can make it so that supply chains end up having some siloing, or there can be some preferential treatments for domestic supply chains over, transnational ones. And I think that is something that goes even outside of food traceability as, a focus. I mean, as you see in a lot of, U.S. initiatives at the moment, there has been movement towards increasing domestic capacity and like fostering resiliency over necessarily, globalized dependencies in critical, industry verticals. And I think that's something, and that is really something that we're seeing elsewhere in the world as well, that this fostering of, domestic production, or at least means to be able to pivot supply when necessary. And I don't think these are things that are necessarily completely unfounded now that we have a, global pandemic that we're still dealing with the consequences of. We are, having this kind of framing of ownership of supply chains as a, political calculus. But getting really back more squarely to food traceability and interoperability in regulatory apparatuses, I would say that I think there's some hope here with the way that the food traceability rule has been written, because it has emphasized the concepts of key data elements and critical tracking events. It's really this scheme that fits well into standardization initiatives and gets us to a way of ascertaining the, context of specific products and being able to have record keeping at specific junctures that can be audited against, can be designed around, and can see interoperability even if there's not necessarily direct eye-to-eye between maybe specific CTE definitions, for instance, or specific individual data elements. I think that this is always a bit of a challenge, though, with food traceability, that you do want to have a very rigid set of key data elements, like in the ideal sense. But then as use cases expand on food traceability, then you can end up having a great deal of complexity, which can lead to challenges in integration. So it's not something I think that is, alien to the area of food traceability, but I think at least with the foray of, the FDA's rule, it will promote this paradigm of, regulatory structures going forward. And I hope that will foster some level of, interoperability between, and intermissibility between regulatory schemes. There has been movement, I think, in talking about this at Codex Alimentarius. I never took Latin, so my pronunciation, the second term, is probably not correct. But I think also engagements in these larger macro level standardization organizations can help deal with some of the challenges that may be presented when there are some differential approaches to food traceability. Now, if you ask me about like specific ones, I mean, there is a Russian food traceability regulatory structure that would be probably a little bit more difficult for there to be harmonization with, but there has been a bit of division between Russian supply chains and the rest and much of the Western world due to world events. But I'm not saying that it is not going to, that it's going to be, I'm not here to say that like there's going to necessarily be one unified way that governments take, but I think moving forward at these concepts can help with the assurance that there can be harmony between regulatory approaches.
Thanks, Thomas. I want to come back at some point during this podcast on the Russia and Chesties Act system, because I spent a fair amount of time on that, and I'd love to hear your perspective. One question I have right now, it relates to your call out on global, the GDST, as well as standards bodies. First of all, I think the GDST has done a great job of creating this common set of parameters for traceability, CTEs, KDEs, and I think they've done a great job in this space. I have a perspective, and I'd like you to knock it down or support, either whatever you'd like to do. I do have this feeling in seafood that there is a bit of a proliferation of certification bodies and standards bodies, and if you look at the global landscape, and do you have any concern that there can be confusion if we don't start honing in on common standards, because these are all global supply chains?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ron. Actually, it's a really brilliant point. There's when I first started at IFT, Tejas Bhatt was the person that hired me, and I worked under him briefly before he went to Walmart. And he had this really funny XKCD comic, which I think is super common, to many standardization geeks like myself. But it's just a simple 3-panel comic where they're describing the challenges with these existing 10 standards, and then they decide to make another standard, and now there's 11 standards. So it's like, the solution to standardization woes are often another standard, and that doesn't solve anything because you are still back where you came from. It's not making the problem worse. I think there's the additional difficulty in that the way that we have moved towards monetization of positive practices in the seafood industry has been through consumer pull, which means that there ends up being this kind of competitive advantage that certification bodies end up marketing for, and so there is no real reason why there can't be competing certification bodies that claim to do very similar things. And the challenge really is that the information and research regarding consumers' level of sophistication to interpret the differences between these certification labels is not, I think, to the level that we can have a great deal of confidence that one certification is going to be seen differently than others. It's actually something that I have a lot of interest in my current research, is really understanding what we can expect of sophisticated and also more, casual, food purchasers when they encounter a variety of level of depths of information and what they necessarily do with this. I think, a lot of the promise behind transparency facilitated through digital traceability is that you can give all this information and allow consumers to kind of mobilize their own fact-checking mechanisms, potentially, rather than trusting a specific label that they really wouldn't have much knowledge of, or even really know necessarily the politics or the economics that moves into whether a company selects one certification label over another. I think in general, it has been a source of positivity for reducing illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, because there has been a way to elevate producers that have made commitments towards better practices, better auditing, third-party oversight, etc. But it becomes a challenge as that becomes more popular. It is easy for additional players to come in to offer a competing product for less that may be less robust, because really at the end of the day, it's just whether a consumer is going to buy it, and that's going to drive really the overall calculus behind retailers' vetting strategies for which certifications their suppliers adhere to, and also feed into really the overall market dynamics. So I do agree it's a challenge. I think in the seafood space specifically, it's a very globalized supply chain. and it's difficult for consumers to really best understand what one label would do over the other, because the average, I think most Westerners have very little knowledge of even that how many tuna species that may they encounter in the tuna can aisle, or what is a bluefin versus a yellowfin tuna taste like, or where would be an appropriate fishing area for that, what would be the appropriate catch or gear to be used with that. So these are all things that are challenging to having an approach that allows for robust outcomes from an environmental perspective, but trust on the consumer side as well. So I think there can be room for this, but at a certain point, there has to be maybe some consensus on an intergovernmental level in order to facilitate some bare minimum threshold. And I think this has happened. We can actually look at some of the lessons in food safety, right? So this is where GFSI has had some success, right? Like there's kind of like an audit, like there's a vetting body of the vetting bodies, right? So there's a minimum set of standards that, have these scientific bases that enable for there to be innovation in individual, third-party certifications, but allows them to coexist in a similar ecosystem. But it does still require a robust stakeholder management and facilitation of that management in a global sense that requires some strategic maneuvering by each of the players involved. So yeah, it's a complicated area, and I probably didn't give a definitive opinion there, but I think maybe it gives folks insights to think about what their approach would be in trying to move the needle one way or the other.
It was a super insightful answer. No, that was great. Thank you.
Thomas, you just unpacked another layer of complexity. We earlier talked about different regulatory systems, how they may affect food traceability. Now we just touched upon variability of certification bodies and the need to educate the consumers. And then earlier you did mention the disparate technologies. So with the supply chain visibility in present day being provided by the technologies and continuously or increasingly aspiring to be provided by technologies rather than any other solution, we're coming across the challenge of interoperable technological solutions as well, especially if we need to make sure that we can trace the origin, or God forbid, the first instance of a bacteria in a fresh food way back to its original starting point. So with your experience at the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, what I would love for you to share with us is what are some of the lessons on interoperability that you can share with our audience for us to think about? And is it something that we can think about standardizing now, or do we need more practice before we can identify what really needs to be standardized for these technologies to have very seamless movement of data about food in the same way as the food and cargo moves from one transportation mean to the other?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Ileana. That's a good topic to tackle here as we're thinking about interoperability as a concept. I think in my journey from IFT and Chipotle and to the FDA, you work with these individual technology companies for quite some time, and then you really unpack layers and layers to what has worked in the past. Because interoperability exists there, right? Like there has to be interoperability for us to have the amount of throughput that we have, for you to be able to scan something at the grocery store and for it to come across that POS, the point of sale system, and for there to be that level of insight even on just like a product class basis, right? So there is a baseline amount of interoperability in the CPG space that we're often leveraging. And this is actually one of the big innovations, I think, that GDST took, was thinking about what systems existed that were most closely related to what we were looking to accomplish, and how could we leverage the standards that exist to go the next step in order to have this means of receiving information, and in order for it to be able to be robustly and logically used with the end recipients of the information. But the thing is like, as you are thinking about going backwards, like when you're looking at these interoperability schemas, they are born out of this history of trying to better the communication between CPG manufacturers, their distributors, and their retail partners. And so when you are going further beyond that to have more end-to-end traceability, the data systems that are involved are different and are not necessarily things that are tracing and tracking. They may be dealing, or they are probably dealing more directly with the processing and the procurement of that food from the environment. And those are data systems that have very different assumptions, very different needs of their users, a different life history in themselves. And so when you're thinking about interoperability schemas that are end-to-end in nature, you have to be wide-eyed when it comes to the technology pieces that are in play at each individual production step. It's not every single actor is going to be using, some SaaS platform to house a bunch of logistics data, because that might not be a core part of their business. They may be most concerned about having reliable harvests or having predictable, ordering progressions, or, being able to facilitate, transportation. And all these things can feed into the traceability information that needs to be collected and needs to be interoperably shared. But it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is going to be selecting one monolithic type of technology or platform to be holistically used. If you're wanting to have true interoperability and a true means of being able to communicate information between these stakeholders, you need to have you need to have an approach that takes in these individual needs or these individual perspectives that feed into their digital environments and build a standard around that. And this lends into kind of the second area that I think is super critical to the success in interoperability and standardization initiatives, which is focusing on the data carrier side as well. I mean, and not being, ignorant or not being not diminishing its role in the criticality of contextualizing that product as it moves from stakeholder to stakeholder. Because ultimately, your system and the interoperability approach is going to be useless if you have no way of efficiently capturing that data at the point of use of the food handler. So, when you are looking at, a means of being able to capture this information upstream, this is something that has to be thought about, you need to have stakeholder inclusions on the ways that they, transport and think about this product and the way that they identify it in their systems and how they would convey that identity to their to their supply chain partners. So I wouldn't say necessarily that GDST robustly tackled all of these questions, but they had all the stakeholders involved in order to even know that these challenges existed in the first place. And those voices need to be at the table in order for you to have the base level problem set to work from, in order to have a solution that can be tested, vetted, and then perhaps ratified. So, and having the variety of stakeholders involved, not just on like the supply chain role, but even on the size and sophisticated of the operation is also key. I think something that is often neglected as well is that you can have globally relevant procurement of products where you may have very small stakeholders that are component of that supply chain. You can have pole and line fishers. You can have, basically very small scale family farms that cultivate, shrimp. So knowing what technology that they have available, what they're using in a day-to-day context, their perspective on identity, and the way that they use those identities to get the things that they need to arbitrate their business is the building blocks towards having interoperability as an overall success in any sort of standardization activity. I really want to get into these questions further, which is, again, a big part of why I'm excited about researching this in an academic setting. But those are some of the lessons that I've learned in GDST, and apply those. I continuously apply those, but definitely there is the physical and the digital side that have to be united in order to have this digitization visibility occur.
Thomas, I feel like if you ask 20 people to define traceability, you get 20 different answers. I think it's a lot of ways that people look at it, and there's some confusion out there. One of the questions, and you and I talked about this when we talked about a month ago, was what distinguishes food traceability from digital food safety? Can you talk a little bit about the distinction between those two?
Yeah, so there's so much excitement around food traceability right now with the rule, with advancements in the standardization space. We've got Sunrise 2027. We have GS1 Digital Link is still fairly fresh in my opinion. We have EPCIS 2.0. So, and all of these things have a lot of applicability to the approach that we take in digital food traceability. And so you would think that is where food safety is advancing, and that is the solution to everything. But the thing that we have to think about is, as I kind of talked about in my in my history, right, of my personal history of working in food traceability, is that there are these two other pillars of foodborne illness investigations, and they relate more directly to that product that is contaminated, or that has something that is wrong with it, maybe a misdeclared allergen. Maybe there was a physical hazard that was introduced into the product. So, traceability is only going to assist you when something has gone wrong, really. There can be ways that you can perhaps spot problematic practices proactively, especially if you can envision a world where you have this batch lot visibility as well as environmental data. Maybe you can, correlate it with some of your cold chain monitoring, and you might see that, hey, I don't like the way that this, delivery underwent. It took too long. It seems like there were some, stops. Like maybe we should investigate the constitution of the product further. But really, food traceability and the digital tools that support it are still going to be most useful for after that product is needs to have action taken upon it, or for there to be some sort of post accountancy. There's many other tools that are being digitized or that are being incorporated into all areas of food handling and in food processing and in harvest safety that should not be neglected. Digital technologies are empowering folks to understand, where maybe new contaminations may be occurring, or maybe where there may be temperature abuse that they didn't see before, because there is a greater ability for them to have constant monitoring, for them to rely less on maybe auditing and more on continuous insight into specific production contexts. So it's important to know, or important to realize that, food traceability isn't going to solve our food safety challenges, and advancements in sequencing technologies and culture independent diagnostic testing, even approaches in interoperability of clinical data can improve our understanding of foodborne illness, improve our understanding of environmental sampling, improve our understanding of preventative controls. But those technologies may not be something that is systematically traced and tracked with the product, but their digitization will assist in the future of food safety. But it is not, the investment in food traceability is not necessarily going to solve everything. And organizations need to see how their overall digital food transformation may improve all of their other practices, including their more traditional food safety activities.
With all this said, I would like to, Thomas, with all that you shared right now, you inspired me to ask you something very, very practical. And that is, do you know of any company, could be food producer, CPG, a retailer, or anything, any food-related sub-industry that, in your opinion, has really mastered the traceability of their food in their supply chain, and ideally done that in real time?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I would say it is very difficult to know until you are actually working for a business how effective their approaches to digital traceability are. I think it's easy to sell a specific tagline or a specific outcome, but there is a lot to traceability that is hunting down your known unknowns and your unknown unknowns, because you can't really measure what you don't have, right? So I think that it is a journey that everybody is on, and everybody is wanting to get towards that threshold where they feel like they have perfect replication of what's happening in the physical realm in their digital systems. But it is, I think it would be difficult to point to anybody that necessarily is doing everything 100% right? So I think what you can look at, though, is that you can look and see who is involved with the standardization initiatives, because those are the ones that are most willing to put their cards on the table and saying, this is what's working really well for us. This is what's not working very well with us, because we're seeing these breakdowns in interoperability. I will say, having worked in the food service sector, that out of everybody out of every sector that has interests within this space in the U.S., they are among the most proactive, the most digitally sophisticated, and the most willing to lay their hands on the table or their cards on the table to share their lessons learned with one another, because they all have this real commitment and need really to have this better visibility. I'm not saying that anybody else is necessarily bad. I think everybody wants to have these optimized outcomes and visibility, because they will pay additional dividends. But it is really difficult when you are, potentially working with a variety of different products. Maybe you have competing priorities. Maybe it's difficult for your organization to see traceability as like a game-changing central component to your overall digital transformation. So, and this is why you see a lot of leadership in food service at the moment. You see their incorporation of novel data carriers like RFID. You see their direct involvement with a lot of standardization initiatives, and you also see their discussion of using traceability as a food safety strategy in public health and food safety conferences and such like that. But I think if you really want to know those that are thinking and are working through these problems most directly, look at the folks that are contributing to GS1 and AIM standards, because they really are committing to working with other stakeholders in a way that they can measure and have outcomes that optimize what they're really looking for. So, and I also say on a global scale, I might be a little bit biased because I worked in the GDST, but there is an overall commitment in seafood to work towards better traceability in a global sense that I think is hard to see in other commodities. There's some drivers in improving traceability in produce, but it's a little bit more localized based on individual contingencies of specific markets. So, even though there's a lot of unification around better label harmonization, such as like the Produce Traceability Initiative, that's kind of centered around North American produce supply chains, you don't necessarily see this proliferation elsewhere in the world in the way that would be ideal. Maybe that's not necessarily maybe it's not as necessary given the nature of how their supply chains are versus seafood ones. But as a whole, there has been this commitment towards harmonization that we've seen in the seafood industry that you haven't seen anywhere else. And you see that in a lot of the approaches that governments are taking. I think GDST has a lot to do with the approach that the FDA has taken in their food traceability rule. But even when you look at other emerging regulatory approaches, such as in Australia and in the European Union, you see some of that inspiration there as well.
Thomas, I've got two more questions. I know we've run over time, but I've got a couple more, and Illyriana may have a couple more too. But one of them is related to solution providers out there, and there's another topic we talked about recently. There's obviously a lot of solution providers out there in the traceability space. Some operating at the L4 level, some throughout L1 through L3. My question for you, and we talked about it recently, is my feeling is that the solutions have a lot in common, but I think they could be missing some technology advancements that we can incorporate into some of the solutions going forward. So that was a bad way of phrasing it, but what are the things that you think may be missing for traceability solution providers from a technology perspective that would enhance traceability going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ron. I think, as I was kind of talking about earlier, like it is highly dependent on, what critical tracking events that your business is operating on which technology decisions that, you end up incorporating into your overall strategy. I think that one of the areas that I've had a lot of interest in, working at the federal governments, but also currently in my academic career, is thinking about, we have been working very hard on technologies that are able to take unstructured data or semi-structured data and codify them and make them into something more sensible or something that's more structured and that we can have some level of inference onto. And there has been this development over the last 15, 20 years as you have seen tools available for the processing of, semantically structured information. At first, this was just thinking about, how do we have like linked objects and better metadata construction on the internet. But this has led also to the way that we actually process writing and other communications on the internet and in our day-to-day activities, and being able to create very powerful tools on top of these. So this pursuit of the usage of natural language processing and then creating these semantic structures has led us to some of the really crazy innovations that we've seen in artificial intelligence recently. But when you think about the solutions that we have challenges, or like the challenges that we have in arriving at interoperability and about being able to marry like very different information with one another, is there is still some latent semantic structures to all of the business information that we have. And there is opportunity for us to use some of these tools that we have for, processing social media data in order to make, a chatbot that gives us like, comprehensible and actually very well written generative text back. But we have the opportunity to understand our own lingo that we have made in business contexts and structure some of these tools around it. And I think there has been an under leveraging of a lot of that capability of recognizing semantic structures that are latent in business information and leveraging them for interoperable purposes. I think we get stuck in this thinking that we need to have everything exactly perfect so that we can line up everything in the spreadsheet at the end of the day and it will all work, and we can just do an X lookup, function, and then we got our, inputs and outputs. But really, we have some capabilities that I think we have overlooked based on, the construction of like knowledge graphs and also the construction of natural language processing inspired semantic structures that can really pay some dividends. And it's not something that I have a lot of competence in, other than being very interested in these technologies and their application, but they could potentially have some growth. And I will also say that I still feel like there is an undervaluing of, the role of data capture as a component of food traceability. And this can be accomplished in more ways than we think possible. And it still leads into artificial intelligence techniques. Now, I have a more broad idea of what artificial intelligence is than a lot of people do. I think it's gotten, kind of boxed into just being this generative, output. But I really kind of think of any sort of activity that is replicating something that would normally be done by a human using our neurological structures can constitute artificial intelligence. So things like image processing, you wouldn't think that this is necessarily something that's smart, like something that is generating something that is having insights in the way that you get when you ask ChatGPT a question. But it is actually performing some sort of analytical technique that you would previously have to rely on a human to do. So things like changing the nature of what we think about what data capture or what data capture is can help us start leveraging additional layers of knowledge that we have about a product's disposition in order to make and improve those inferences. So what I'm talking about is, we have cameras that are available. We have data carriers that can be captured by these cameras. The cameras are increasing their resolution over time, and they are becoming cheaper over time. So how do we have the recognition of the food handler, their association with these products, their association with an individual production context, the corroboration of its geolocation, and how do we relate that to the processes of, what we traditionally think of as data capture, such as scanning a barcode or scanning an RFID tag, labeling it with pallet label, having that check-in, check-out procedure. Like, how do we have this interpolation of the variety of data that we do capture and taking advantage of the processing of that data to, give us an insight that we previously didn't have before. These are areas that there could definitely be investment in my opinion. And there is, there are startups and there are established companies that are looking at these technologies in a variety of ways. But a lot of what you end up seeing that are like talking about turnkey solutions for food traceability are really just taking in that information directly, blindly trusting it and putting it into a repository. And you basically are charged with figuring out yourself how to make that data clean enough for you to use. And so that's where I think a lot of these advanced techniques and being able to get insights and find where those unknown unknowns are could really be benefited by these technology applications.
That's a great answer, Tom. Thank you so much. Illyriana, you want the last question?
I would love just to dive a bit deeper into the AI, because one thing that you mentioned earlier, like somebody down the line in the food service might not necessarily need a very advanced technology to manage their operations and produce different kind of data. But then somebody on the other end of the chain may be way much more advanced. And then we see on this side of the hemisphere, there's way much more investments in generative artificial intelligence solutions, while on the other parts of the world, it may be less. So the adoption of advanced solutions is still disparate. And we know that even within the logistics industry, there is still resistant pockets of adopting technology because it's not a business viable solution to have. So where do you see the challenges and the opportunities in this disparate technological adoption? And how can we ensure that food traceability becomes something that is valued equally by all in the supply chain, but then also that technology that needs to ensure traceability is adopted equally and practiced equally by all to ensure that we produce real-time end-to-end data on food that matter to all of us, rather than to just some stakeholders in the supply chain?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Ileana. I think it's a challenge because the leaders that we see in the technology aspects of food traceability still have a lot of them, or the vast majority of them, have very expensive components that are kind of bare minimum necessities to get to that digital record, and in order for companies to take advantage of it. And I think this is something that, I think it depends on the construction of the technology silo going forward, right? So, and the ways in which we design business models to support these. I think because there has been this pipeline from interoperable data systems that concentrate on CPG to retail supply chains. Like, there has been this kind of investment in hardware and software solutions that are really overbuilt for all of these specific contexts. But as you get to smaller and smaller contexts, the types of solutions that you would normally buy for food traceability aren't necessarily what you would need, but that market hasn't really developed yet, right? So things that you're kind of thinking about are like mobile computers, for instance. Like, mobile computers are very necessary for food distributors and retailers, or for large retailers, and for for food processors. Like, there are and there's a need for them to be ruggedized, for them to be environmentally resilient, et cetera. But they are at a fairly expensive cost, and it may be something that can be a very expensive capital investment for other stakeholders that wouldn't necessarily be, utilizing their full capabilities in the first place. So there needs to be, a way of being able to take technology that already is accessible to these other contexts, and being able to retrofit it or to take advantage of it for the data capture side of food traceability record keeping. Again, you can have all the interoperability in the world, but if you don't have a way of being able to efficiently capture it in the operational components of your business, it makes it pretty much impossible to accomplish. So that's where you have to think about, maybe more creatively, about what tools are available, what are things that can be little to no cost, what pieces of technology are already in existence that we can utilize. But we aren't necessarily going to get there until we start seeing a way for startups and just very curious developers to use maybe something that hasn't been thought about in a creative way. So I think that the fostering of new players to be disruptive to the hardware and data capture space can be of benefit. Not necessarily for the big guys, but for ensuring these low and no cost solutions. But also, there needs to be, I think, a sharing and cross linkage in the standardization space in order to have a bit of that growth, that organic growth from the developer side. And so what I'm kind of talking about there is, there is a great deal of passion towards facilitating these low and no cost solutions through existing technologies, when you're able to get the problem in front of the developers that get excited about these types of problems. But they may be far removed from the food system. And the way to get them involved, though, is often to take these maybe fairly arcane food traceability and supply chain visibility standards and make them accessible to more widely trafficked forums for technology exchange, things like the Linux Foundation, or things such as their incorporation into open source foundation activities. These are ways for these problem sets to be accessible, for there to be solutions developed around them, and for there to be the distribution of technological solutions that may not have the costs borne on them. And then lastly, I think there still needs to be a cultivation of, global stakeholder engagement. I think that I think the U.S. does have some level of cohesion between their standardization initiatives between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, but there needs to be understanding of the technological context of every production context as well. So this may extend beyond even their immediate technologies that they have available, and also into what are their concerns regarding record keeping. Record keeping may be problematic to small stakeholders in developing countries for other purposes, maybe due to what needs their local bureaucrats have in overseeing their business activities, et cetera. So those are some of the things I kind of think about with trying to democratize maybe the technology applications, and hopefully that we can take advantage of hardware that we already have, such as people's smartphones, et cetera. But it will require the development of new business models in order to make those tools accessible and affordable to smaller stakeholders.
Thomas, I'm going to just show a little behind the scene magic here. So we've only got through about one half of the questions we had for you, but this was such an amazing conversation with you. We'd love to schedule more time and do a part two, but this has been a great conversation. And like I said in the beginning, you're one of the smartest guys and one of the guys that I think communicates so well and so succinctly about what needs to be done in the space. So I can't tell you how much we appreciate you joining us.
Thanks so much, Ron. I don't know if succinct is the right word for me sometimes, but as I can get really analytical into my answers, and then I start getting more and more interested in the overall implications that can occur. But I always love to share the knowledge that I've had, and I think the approach that I have pursued is taking what I've learned and making it accessible for the improvement overall of these systems that are important to everybody. Everybody eats. So I want to make sure that they have safe food, that they have food that tastes good, and also food that is cultivated in such a way that it will be sustainable into the future and for future generations.
Thomas, cool. This has been a super inspirational conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your profound, super deep insights about the importance of food traceability, but also highlighting some of the challenges that still lie ahead of us all to make sure that we know all the time where the food is coming from, how healthy it is, and it feeds us and keeps us safe rather than contaminating our bodies with unnecessary organisms and illnesses. So thank you so much. Keep doing what you're doing. Good luck with your research, and keep us posted with your findings, because we would love to welcome you back.
Yeah, definitely. I'm very excited. So I'll be sharing them out as they come about.
I found this conversation truly enlightening. One of the key special takeaways was the importance it highlights on regulation to drive innovation of traceability of food supply chain. However, in spite of pretty interconnected digital world and advanced technologies, what is clear is that there is a multitude of challenges that remain and are waiting for the next generation of innovations.
Tom is truly one of the smartest and most clever leaders I know in the food safety space, and his insights for the industry are invaluable. He has a rare talent, the ability to make the complex simple to understand. He really is one of my go-to people when it comes to food traceability. So listeners, as always, we'd love to hear from you and what your key takeaways were. So drop us a message for a chance for your message to be played in one of our next episodes.
And lastly, we know that we have used several acronyms in this conversation that, should you be listening to a story of this nature for the very first time, it may leave you wondering. But no worries, we have your back. In the summary notes of this podcast, you will find the acronyms and the explanations, along with few interesting resources that you may want to check in case discussion has triggered your curiosity to learn more about food traceability.
Beyond Visibility Lounge is produced by the Open Solve Studio in collaboration with TraceChain. So follow us to never miss an episode and share a review on how we're doing. And if you know anybody that would be interested in this topic, please send them the link. You may make their day.
And last but not least, a big shout out goes to ZBox America for supporting the production of this episode by opening up its podcast recording studio. Stay tuned for more innovation-driven conversations.